January 26, 1945. The winter sky over eastern France hung low. The clouds pressed down like a great gray weight upon the ruined fields of Holtzwihr. Snow, churned into dirty ridges by days of bombardment, lay fused into sheets of ice that glimmered faintly in the feeble afternoon light. In the distance, artillery muttered like an approaching storm, and in those haunted hours, a young officer thin, limping, barely old enough to shave-walk the frozen line as if preparing himself for a verdict that only war could hand down. Second Lieutenant Audie Leon Murphy had no business being alive in that landscape, let alone leading what remained of Company B, 19 years old, fevered with exhaustion, a leg wound burning beneath the cloth of his combat trousers. He carried himself with a calmness so absolute that the men around him took comfort in it without fully understanding why. They saw only the steady eyes and the level voice. They could not see the years that had carved themselves into him. Long before the war had, the cotton fields of Hunt County, Texas felt impossibly far from the blackened tree line, outside the village of Holtzwihr. But the habits shaped in that red soil followed him still. Long before he wore an officer's insignia, Murphy had measured his life one bullet at a time, hunting small game with the accuracy his family's survival demanded. A missed shot meant an empty skillet. A steady hand meant another day endured. War did not teach him how to kill. It simply expanded the distance. By the time Murphy reached the Colmar pocket that January, he had already fought across Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and the long, bitter roads of southern France. Decorations cluttered the left side of his jacket, but they were not adornments. They were markers of nights spent in mud with death pressing close. He had survived ambushes that wiped out entire units, crawled through shattered vineyards under machine gun fire, and watched more friends die before his 19th birthday than many men see in a lifetime. Each loss cut into him with an invisible blade, and though he rarely spoke of it, the wounds never stopped bleeding. The Colmar pocket was Hitler's last foothold on French soil, a defiant wedge of territory west of the Rhine that refused to fall. Despite the Allies' growing momentum, the Germans had reinforced it with their best winter. Troops the 2nd Mountain Division, men seasoned in the Arctic winds of Norway and Finland, soldiers who prided themselves on never yielding. For them, losing ground was shame. For Murphy's company, running low on ammunition and rations, losing ground meant extinction. Company B had arrived in the sector with 187 men. Now they were 40. Frostbite gnawed at their feet. Days without sleep blurred their vision. Their foxholes were shallow scratches in ground too frozen to dig. Field telephones crackled with uncertain connections. Every breath came out in small white ghosts that vanished before they reached the treetops. Murphy knew what was coming long before the first artillery rounds began to fall. The Germans moved with the patience of predators. A half-hour of bombardment shattered branches overhead, showering the American lines with splinters sharper than knives. Shells burst against the frozen trunks, turning the forest edge into a cauldron of smoke, shrapnel, and torn earth. Men crouched low, clutching rifles that felt heavier in the biting cold. Some prayed in whispers barely audible above the detonations. Others sat in silence, absorbing the moment with the resignation of men who believe they are about to die. When the barrage finally lifted, snow drifted down in glittering sheets. For a moment, the battlefield was terribly quiet, as if the earth had drawn in a breath. Then Private Donald Ekman saw them. Across the wide, miserable field, nearly a mile of open ground, white shapes began to appear. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. German infantry in snow smocks, advancing in long, disciplined lines. Behind them, 6 tanks rolled forward, their engines rumbling like metal beasts. Panzer IVs, scarred from previous battles, moved with methodical confidence. Their commanders expected an easy kill. Murphy's men did not break, but their silence deepened. 40 Americans against 250. German veterans and armored support. The mathematics were merciless. Murphy grabbed the field telephone, his voice steady as he called for artillery fire. But he could read a battlefield the way some men read scripture, and he knew shells alone would not stop that white tide. He studied the terrain, where the ground rose, where the fields dipped, how the smoke from earlier barrages drifted. He calculated distances under breath that frosted in the air. Everything in him tightened into concentration. The two M10 tank destroyers positioned. Behind the American line rotated their turrets, searching for targets. When the German armor reached 600 yards, the M10 crews opened fire. Their rounds arced across the field and missed. The cold had stiffened their fingers, dulled their timing. A single 80mm from the German side corrected the mistake. It struck the rear M10 square in the turret. The explosion threw black smoke into the sky and sent the crew scrambling for cover. The second M10 tried to reposition but slid helplessly on the frozen mud, dropping into a ditch where its tracks churned uselessly. Its men climbed out and ran, and in the space of a few minutes, the American line lost the only weapons capable of stopping the German tanks. Murphy understood the meaning of that moment with dreadful clarity. If the infantry held the woods, they would be encircled. If they fell back without covering fire, they would be cut down in the open. Every scenario ended in annihilation except one. He ordered his men to retreat deeper into the woods, but he did not follow them. He ran toward the burning tank destroyer. Witnesses later described it as an act beyond reason. Flames pulsed from the rear of the vehicle. Ammunition inside it hissed and crackled, threatening to erupt into a violent detonation. Smoke stung the air, but Murphy climbed onto the hull as if mounting a horse he had known since childhood. The metal scorched through his gloves. Heat shimmered around him. Through the smoke, he could see the German infantry beginning to fan out, rifles lifting toward him. He gripped the handles of the .50 caliber M2 Browning. The weapon was heavy, brutal, and magnificent, a machine gun designed to tear through steel and bone alike. Its barrel glowed faintly from earlier firing. Murphy squeezed the trigger. The gun answered with a roar that cut through the winter air. From his perch, he had a field of fire stretching across the entire width of the German advance. The burning vehicle rose like a black altar beneath him, silhouetting his form against the sky. German bullets snapped past him, kicking sparks from the metal, but he did not duck. He fired in long, controlled bursts, never wasting a round, moving the barrel with a hunter's instinct rather than a soldier's training. German infantry began to fall, first in ones, then in clusters. The tanks hesitated. They had no infantry shield. Their commanders stared through, scopes and periscopes at the lone figure on the tank. Destroyer, a figure enveloped in smoke, firing relentlessly, calling down artillery with one hand while operating the machine, gun with the other. German accounts rarely mention what happened next, but survivors in Company B remembered it with the clarity of trauma. Murphy fought like a man who had stepped outside his own fear. Snowflakes melted on the glowing barrel of the Browning. Smoke curled around him in black ribbons. Shells landed so close to the burning vehicle that debris rained upon his shoulders. Yet he stayed, weaving bursts of fire across the field, cutting down German troops who tried to flank, who crawled, who sprinted, who faltered under the hail of bullets. Minutes became an hour, and the Germans' elite mountain troops with years of combat could not break him. As the ammunition dwindled and the Browning's thunder began to fade, Murphy saw the infantry regrouping for a final rush. He lifted the telephone receiver, his voice rough but steady, and ordered artillery to fire directly on his position. It was the decision of a man who believed he would die there, but he refused to die alone. When the shells struck, the field erupted in geysers of frozen earth. The Germans broke, and the boy from Texas, scorched, bleeding, trembling with exhaustion, climbed down from the burning wreck that finally exploded minutes after he left it. Behind him, the snow was no longer white. He limped back into the woods, where his men watched in stunned silence as he lit a cigarette with hands that did not shake. And the enemy still had teeth. But that afternoon, as the snow thickened and the wind hissed between the ruined houses, every man in Company B understood something they had never fully grasped until now. They followed a leader who would rather die than give ground. Night came slowly, sinking the village into a blue twilight. Fires smoldered in the distance where the German vehicles had burned. The sky glowed faintly orange to the west, artillery flashes reflecting off low clouds. Murphy sat alone on a fallen beam outside the village hall. His leg ached sharply. He tried adjusting the bandage beneath his trouser leg, but winced. For the first time since dawn, his hands trembled. His breath, though steady, came shallow. The adrenaline was fading. The weight of what he had done, what he had survived, settled upon him like the cold. Sergeant Hale approached, stopping a respectful few feet away. "Sir, you saved the whole company today." Murphy didn't look up. "I lost too many already." The words were low, tight. They came from a place inside him no metal could reach. Hale nodded, swallowing hard. We held the line. Because of you. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the whistle of wind between broken shutters. Murphy finally lifted his gaze. His expression was not proud, nor hardened. It was tired, painfully young, and shadowed by the ghosts that followed him from every battlefield. We held it today, he said softly. Tomorrow, we see. The night deepened over Holtzvir until the village vanished. Into darkness. No street lamps, no distant headlights, only the faint glow of snow-covered ruins and the lingering scent of smoke drifting through icy air. Company B settled into defensive positions among the shattered houses, their silhouettes barely visible through the drifting flakes. Murphy finally allowed himself to lower his rifle. For hours he had moved like a machine coordinating, checking perimeters, ensuring ammunition was distributed, confirming the wounded were stable. But now that the immediate threat had passed, the edges of exhaustion pressed into him with almost physical force. He dropped onto a broken stone bench beside the frozen fountain, resting his elbows on his knees. Steam rose faintly from his breath. His eyelids felt heavy enough to collapse shut permanently. He didn't notice the cold anymore. It was the silence that unsettled him. Most battles ended in noise, the distant rumble of tanks, the scream of shells, the crackle of flamethrowers licking through vineyards or farmhouses. But tonight, after the shattering violence of the afternoon, the world was eerily still, too still. He rubbed his temples, trying to ease the throbbing there. His thoughts drifted unexpectedly back, to Texas, not to childhood, memories of poverty or responsibility, but to the rare moments when the world felt simple. The rhythmic hum of cicadas at dusk, the warmth of sunlight on open fields, his mother's voice humming hymns so quietly, the melody almost disappeared into air. He hadn't heard silence like that since he was 13. A crunch of snow behind him snapped him back to the present. Private Sipper approached, carrying a tin mug of coffee that steamed faintly in the cold. "Sir," Sipper said gently, holding it out, "you should drink something." Murphy accepted the mug but did not lift it to his lips. "Thank you," he murmured. Sipper hesitated. The men rarely addressed Murphy directly unless necessary. His presence calm, unbreakable, uncompromising was comforting in combat, but intimidating in quiet moments. Still, Sipper swallowed, gathering what courage he had. "What you did out there? Sir, I've never seen anything like it. None of us have." Murphy stared into the coffee, watching the steam twist. "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly. Sipper nodded, not fully understanding what the lieutenant meant, but sensing the subject was not one to push. After the private left, Murphy remained motionless for a long time, the coffee cooling in his hands. He replayed the battle in his mind, not the heroics others would later describe, but the moments only he could feel, the snap of the machine gun firing too close to his ear, the sting of hot metal biting into his cheek, the ringing silence after each burst, when his mind expected death but the next bullet somehow missed. He had thrown everything he was at the Germans. Not for heroism, not for glory, but because there was nowhere left to fall back to. Because his men were behind him. Because someone had to stand. He took a sip of the now lukewarm coffee, letting its bitterness fill the cold in his chest. Then a soft voice behind him broke the stillness. "Murph?" He turned. It was Johnson, one of the youngest soldiers in the company, barely 18, with wide dark eyes that didn't yet know how to hide fear. "You all right?" Johnson asked hesitantly. Murphy almost smiled at the question. The truth that he was exhausted, injured, numb inside, and carrying the weight of 50 dead friends was too heavy for a boy like Johnson. So he gave the easiest lie a soldier can offer. "I'm fine." Johnson's shoulders relaxed at the reassurance. He nodded and headed back to his post. When he disappeared into the darkness, Murphy whispered the truth to the empty air. "No, I'm not." The wind swallowed the words before they reached the trees. Hours passed. Snow thickened. The men drifted in and out of shallow sleep, waking at every distant thud of artillery somewhere in the east. Shortly past midnight, Captain Knight arrived with 2 runners. Their boots crunched on the icy ground as they approached. "Murphy's makeshift command post." "Lieutenant," Knight said, breath fogging in the air, "Division wants a full account of today's action." "They're stunned you held this sector," Murphy nodded, but his mind did not reach for the words. Reports were technical, sterile things numbers, distances, timings, casualties. They did not capture the truth of what war demanded. The forest swallowed him in. Fragments of gray shadow as he rejoined the remnants of Company B. Men stared at him as if witnessing something unreal, something that did not belong to the realm of ordinary flesh and bone. Smoke clung to his jacket. Soot stained one side of his face. His eyes, though steady, carried the distant sheen of someone who had gone far beyond fear and returned alone. Sergeant Harvey Hale stepped forward first, unable to hide the disbelief in his voice. "Murph, we thought you were dead." Murphy didn't answer immediately. He exhaled a long breath, white vapor curling from his lips, and only then did his voice emerge low, worn but controlled. "Get the men ready," he said. "They'll be back." It was not bravado. It was prediction. The Germans had not expected one man to halt an entire assault, but now wounded pride would force their hand. The Colmar pocket was collapsing inch by inch, squeezed by French and American forces closing from the north and south. Every hour the Germans failed to break the line in Holtzwihr was another hour the noose tightened. Murphy knew they would attack again, and he knew they had one advantage left: rage. The men gathered in a semicircle around him, their breaths steaming through chapped lips, faces gaunt from hunger. Some were barely older than boys. Others had fought since North Africa. But in the silence of that forest, something shifted inside them. If one soldier injured, alone, standing on a burning tank could hold back a battalion, then perhaps they could hold whatever came next. They spread out along the shallow foxholes, checking rifles stiff with cold, exchanging glances that carried more weight than words. The world beyond the tree line was a sheet of pale gray, the battlefield stretching silent and empty except for drifting smoke and bodies, half buried in churned snow. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The silence grew uneasy. Murphy remained crouched behind a tree, binoculars pressed to his eyes. His leg throbbed, but he ignored the pain with practiced indifference. From the moment he'd first held a rifle at age 10, pain was something to be endured, not discussed. Finally, he lowered the binoculars. "They're pulling back," he said. A wave of relief swept through the woods. For the first time in hours, the men allowed themselves to breathe. Some settled into the snow, closing their eyes for precious seconds of rest. Others leaned against the trees, letting their rifles drop to their thighs. The forest was still. Even the distant artillery had quieted. But Murphy was not satisfied. He stepped forward, scanning the field again, studying the patterns, the enemy's retreat left behind, the tracks in the snow, the direction of their movement, the missing tank support. The Germans weren't reorganizing for a second attack. They were fleeing, and the Americans had a narrow window to strike. "Mount up," Murphy ordered. "We're counterattacking." The men groaned, exhausted and they trusted him. They would always trust him. They advanced cautiously through the snowy clearing, weaving between the craters, and the smoldering remains of the M10 that had carried Murphy into legend. Heat still radiated from its twisted metal. The snow around it had melted into a dark pool, refrozen into glassy black ice. Past it lay nearly 100 German bodies, sprawled where they had fallen, rifles frozen beside stiffened fingers. Others lay half buried by the bursting artillery Murphy himself had called down. The men walked through the aftermath slowly, soberly, not triumphant, not jubilant, but quiet. War did not encourage celebration. Victory here was measured in minutes of survival, nothing more. 50 yards past the field's center, Murphy stopped. Track slots of them ran toward the east, deep grooves where German boots had pounded the snow in a panicked, disordered retreat. Equipment littered the path: helmets, ammunition pouches, discarded rifles. He knelt beside one helmet, brushing away the snow. The embossed eagle and swastika glinted faintly beneath the frost. He studied it for a long moment. "They didn't fall back," Murphy murmured. "They broke." He rose, turning to his men. "We pushed them all the way back to Holtzwihr. Keep your spacing. Keep moving." The counterattack began. They advanced in a staggered line toward the village, the wind rising at their backs, flurries swirling like ghostly ribbons across the ground. The nearer they came to Holtzwihr, the more signs of the German withdrawal revealed themselves: abandoned. Machine gun nests, hastily severed telephone wires, crates of mortar rounds left untouched in the snow. The enemy had not simply retreated. They had run. For the first time in days, hope crept into the hearts of the Americans. They reached the edge of the village and swept through the outer. Houses' shell-pocked stone walls, shattered windows, doorways splintered by blasts. Inside, furniture lay overturned, dust suspended in the cold air, frozen footprints tracking across wooden floors. No Germans, no resistance, only silence. Murphy checked his watch. The entire operation from his stand on the burning M10 to securing the village had lasted little more than 3 hours. 3 hours that saved the flank of the entire 3rd Infantry Division. 3 hours that stopped an armored assault dead in its tracks. 3 hours that rewrote military textbooks for generations. But for Murphy, it was not glory. It was not heroism. It was survival raw, instinctive, and heavy with the weight of necessity. He gathered his men in the village square, where a fountain lay cracked and dry beneath layers of ice. Snow began falling harder now, swirling through the empty streets. The men huddled close, listening as Murphy delivered the same order he had given at Anzio, at Montelimar, at the countless ridgelines and vineyards they had crossed since '43. Dig in. There would be no rest, not yet. The Colmar pocket would not fall for another week. They could not. Write what needs to be written, Murphy said quietly. Leave the rest. Knight studied him for a long moment. You know what you did today is going to echo far beyond this village, right? Men will talk about it for years. Murphy looked away toward the dark field where so many bodies still lay frozen. I didn't do it to be remembered. Knight exhaled, his breath mixing with the falling snow. Maybe not, he said softly. But you will be. He left Murphy alone with the cold. The night slowly bled into dawn. A pale blue glow touched the horizon, revealing the ravaged field once more, the burned-out tank destroyer, the frozen craters, the long lines of footprints marking where the Germans had vanished. Company B stirred awake. Men stretched stiff limbs, brushed frost from their jackets, and whispered about breakfast that didn't exist. Murphy stood. His leg ached, but he ignored it. He had ignored worse. He walked to the edge of the village, resting one hand against a splintered fence post as he surveyed the field. Where he had made his stand, the air was painfully crisp, the snow untouched overnight. Birds had not yet returned. The world felt suspended in the aftermath of something too large for sound. Behind him, Sergeant Hale approached once more. Orders? Hale asked. Murphy scanned the horizon. We hold, he said. Until relieved. Hale nodded and walked off to rally the men. Murphy remained where he was, feeling the wind brush his face. Somewhere behind him, a church bell-long silence shifted in the breeze, emitting a faint metallic creak. He closed his eyes. For a moment, it almost sounded like peace, but the war was not over. The Colmar pocket still burned, and the boy from Texas would be sent into battle again and again, each fight carving deeper into the man he was becoming. Yet nothing not before or after would ever quite match the day he stood alone in a field of ice and fire, held back an army, and changed the fate of an entire division. Dawn's pale light slowly strengthened, washing the ruins of Holtzwihr in a cold blue haze. The snow glowed faintly, softening the brutal scars left by tanks and artillery. Yet nothing could soften the memories etched into the minds of the men who had survived the previous day. Company B stirred restlessly, adjusting gear stiff with frost, stamping life back into numbed feet. A medic checked frostbite cases with a grim expression. Somewhere in the quiet, someone hummed a tune so softly it almost blended with the whispering wind. Murphy walked among them, silent, observant. No speech, no reassurance, only presence. And strangely, that was enough. Men who were half broken by fatigue straightened when he approached. Those who doubted they could endure another hour found resolve in the steadiness of his gaze. He didn't inspire them with words. He inspired them because he refused to fall. By mid-morning, the distant rumble of engines reached the village American vehicles, moving fast through the snow. Choked roads. A column from the 30th Infantry Regiment rolled in, their half-tracks lumbering between shattered houses. Soldiers inside waved wearily, their faces smudged with soot. Relief had finally arrived. Captain Knight hurried toward Murphy, a rare smile crossing his face. Looks like you bought us more than time, Lieutenant. You held the entire flank, but Murphy wasn't looking at night. He was watching the newcomers' fresh troops, stepping into a village that smelled of ash and cordite, eyes widening as they saw the burned tank destroyer still smoking faintly, the dark stains in the snow, the fields that glistened with silent carnage. Some of them whispered his name. News had outrun the relief column. Stories had traveled by radio, by rumor, by sheer disbelief. They stared at him with awe that made him uncomfortable. He looked away. Knight clapped him gently on the shoulder. Headquarters wants to see you. They're sending a jeep. Murphy nodded. He didn't ask why. He already knew. Medals, citations, praise, all the things he never wanted. He turned and walked toward the center of the village, where the frozen fountain stood like a monument to some ancient tragedy. As he passed, the men of Company B straightened instinctively. A few saluted. A few simply stared with quiet gratitude. Murphy paused only once, when he saw Sergeant Hale helping Private Johnson rewrap his frostbitten hands. Johnson looked up, hopeful, uncertain. "You did good yesterday," Murphy said softly. Johnson blinked, caught off guard. I didn't do anything compared to you, sir." Murphy shook his head gently. "You stayed," he said. "That's enough." And then he moved on. The jeep arrived shortly after noon, tires crunching through the snow as it rolled to a stop near the village hall. The driver hopped out, saluting sharply. "Lieutenant Murphy, Division HQ requests your immediate presence. General, Dahlquist personally." Murphy felt something knot in his stomach at the name. He didn't dislike the general, far from it, but Dahlquist's presence meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant questions he didn't want to answer. He climbed into the jeep, settling into the cold metal seat as the engine restarted. The vehicle rumbled away from Holtzwihr, past the fields where the dead still lay in silence, past the burned wrecks and shattered trees, past the place where he had made his impossible stand. Snow whipped past him in thin, ghost-like strands. The wind stung his damaged cheek. He kept his eyes forward. As they drove, the landscape shifted from ruins to open countryside. Frost coated the trees like glass. A column of French tanks rumbled in the opposite direction, their crews waving cheerfully at the young American officer in the jeep. When they reached division headquarters, a cluster of commandeered farm buildings, reinforced with sandbags, Murphy stepped down, pulling his jacket tight around him. A staff officer approached immediately. "They're expecting you," he said, gesture terse but respectful. Inside, warmth hit him like a physical force. A stove rattled in the corner, glowing red-hot. Maps covered the walls, marked with blue and red lines showing the tightening choke around the Colmar pocket. General Dahlquist stood at a long table studying a report. When Murphy entered, the general looked up. For a moment there was no speech, only silence. Then Dahlquist walked toward him slowly. "Lieutenant Murphy," he said quietly, "we've read the accounts. All of them. Is it true?" Murphy shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Sir, I did what had to be done." Dahlquist studied him, not the legend, not the report, but the man. The youth still visible beneath the soot, the exhaustion bleeding through the posture, the unspoken weight in the eyes. "You held off an entire battalion," Dahlquist said. "Yes, sir." "On a burning tank destroyer." "Yes, sir." "Alone." Murphy inhaled slowly. "Someone had to stay." Dahlquist's voice softened. "And why did it have to be you?" Murphy hesitated, then, "Because my men were all I had left, sir?" The general closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the gravity of those words. When he opened them again, they glistened with something close to fatherly sorrow. "Lieutenant," he said, "you just earned the highest award this country can give, and you earned it the hard way." Murphy's jaw tightened. Medals did not bring back the dead. They did not quiet the nightmares that came when the guns fell silent. They did not erase the screams that echoed long after battlefields were cold. He nodded politely, but his voice was subdued. "Thank you, sir." Dahlquist reached out and placed a firm hand on Murphy's shoulder. "You're a brave soldier," he said. "But bravery is not the same as invincibility. Remember that." Murphy didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. That night back in Holtzwihr, Company B gathered around a small fire humming in an old metal drum scavenged from a wrecked shed. The flames flickered orange against their faces. casting long shadows on the walls of ruined houses. When Murphy returned, limping slightly, the men shifted to make space for him. Johnson handed him a tin cup of heated broth. Hale nudged a blanket toward him without a word. Murphy sat in the circle silently, warmth creeping slowly into his numb fingers. Private Sipper finally spoke, voice hesitant. "What did they say?" Murphy stared into the fire. "They're giving me a medal." The men exchanged glances. Some smiled weakly. Some nodded. Some muttered congratulations, but none cheered. They knew Murphy, too. Well, they knew medals never touched, the part of him where the real wounds lived. He sipped the broth. It burned his tongue, but he didn't flinch. Around him, the men leaned closer to the fire, seeking its heat against the endless winter. Above them, the sky glittered with distant stars, cold and indifferent, watching silently as young soldiers carried the full weight of history on their scarred, frozen shoulders.